Hello everyone, Charles Watts here. Welcome back to Inside Arsenal, where as you can see, I'm joined today by a very special guest, Alex Kirkland, the Madrid correspondent for ESPN, to talk about Andrea Berta, who has finally been confirmed as Arsenal's new sporting director. Alex, thanks for coming on the show. How are you?
It's my pleasure, mate. I've been listening to you and reading you talk about Arsenal and write about Arsenal for a long time. So it's an absolute pleasure to be on.
Fantastic. And that hopefully is going to make this even better because you're not just Madrid correspondent for ESPN, but you're actually also an Arsenal fan as well. So you're going to have some really good insight into what you think Andrea Berta is going to bring. As I said at the start, finally, long-awaited confirmation in true Arsenal style, dragging it on a fair while before they make the announcement. But he was confirmed yesterday at about 11:30 a.m. on a Sunday, which I really don't understand why they waited for then to do that. But he has been confirmed. And so, yeah, obviously in your work, you know all about Andrea Berta. You've seen his success firsthand at Atletico Madrid. So from a sort of Arsenal point of view, and with your Arsenal hat on, I suppose, what were your sort of immediate thoughts when, it certainly looked like, and now obviously has resulted in Berta being appointed at Arsenal?
I think just that it made a lot of sense. It made a lot of sense if you looked around Europe at the candidates with the right kind of skill set, the right sort of elite experience, the right contacts book, who were available as well, because of course he had left Atletico Madrid, so he was available to sign for a new club without any kind of difficult negotiations or anything like that. I think he probably was the outstanding candidate. Does that mean that I think he's kind of the ideal candidate, or there aren't sort of question marks about him? No, because I think there are. But I think it makes sense. Like I say, when you looked around at the market and the options out there, I think this was the guy that it made a lot of sense for Arsenal to go for.
Yeah, he certainly brings an awful lot of experience and know-how, you would say. When he left Madrid, what was it, February, I think it was, wasn't it, that he left Madrid? Around then, was it? What was the sort of feeling behind him sort of going? Were people upset? Were fans, concerned? I mean, was people happy? Why did he go? And what was the feeling behind the departure?
It's really interesting. I was thinking about this. I think one thing that really stands out from his time at Atletico Madrid is just how low profile he has been, given that he's been, one of the most kind of influential and powerful men in Spanish football. And that sort of goes for his departure as well. His departure was really quite low profile. You ask how people reacted. There wasn't a huge amount of reaction here, even among Atletico Madrid fans. There was no sort of outpouring of grief, but there wasn't sort of celebration. It had been coming for a while. We can talk about that, but it had been coming for a little while. So it wasn't a surprise at all when it eventually happened. We were sort of waiting for it to happen for months before it eventually did. But that's the thing that really stands out for me, that this really has been a guy who, even though he's been sporting director at certainly the third most successful club in Spain, arguably the third biggest club in Spain, you can debate that, the third or the fourth or the fifth. But the fact that he's been there for a decade as sporting director, and for a little while before that as well, and yet has managed to keep a really low profile. Hasn't given one single media interview, not one, in his whole time here. He's never spoken to the press. There are no quotes from him out there in public about sort of his philosophy or his ideas or anything like that. And look, he's not the only sporting director who operates like that. There are a lot of them, I think, who prefer to keep a lower profile. There are others who operate more as sort of the figurehead for the club, right? And the sort of the face and the voice of the club. But he certainly wasn't that at Atletico Madrid. I think in terms of how Atletico Madrid fans think about him, I mean, obviously they look at his time at the club and they see that it coincides with literally the most consistently successful spell in the club's history in terms of what they've done. When he just arrived, this was before he was sporting director, but when he was as part of the sort of the scouting team, they won the league in 2014. They got to the Champions League final. They followed that by getting to the Champions League final again 2 years later. They won the league again in 2021. They've always finished in the top four, always made the Champions League, which has been their objective. Always. That's sort of the minimum standard they set each season, is qualifying for the top four. They've done that. So people sort of recognize, I think, that track record and that he's been a part of that. They wouldn't say that he's been the most important part of that, because the most important part of that obviously has been Diego Simeone, who is sort of, if not bigger than the club, is on the way to sort of being as big as the club, or sort of you can't really separate him and the club at this point, and their identities are just sort of like so he's the guy. Simeone is the guy that's really been the most important part of making it happen by a long way. But Berta's been there, and in terms of the teams that they've built, people might have doubts about some of the signings, some of the players that have come in, some of the players that have left, some of the ways that those things have been handled. But I think that's the case with almost any football executive, any sporting director. It's very, no one's got a 100% record, have they? So when he left, like I say, it had been on the cards for a while. People weren't sort of distraught about it, because I think that Atletico Madrid are in a pretty good place. But there was a recognition generally. I think if you ask most Atletico Madrid fans, they would say, yeah, he overall he did a good job, and in many ways a very good job.
It's interesting you say that about how he doesn't give any media interviews, anything. I mean, it sounds like the polar opposite to Edu, who was, he loved getting in front of a camera. Edu, he didn't do it enough, to be honest, but if he could have done, and, I think he would have done, but the way Arsenal operate, obviously, he was never sort of front and centre all the time. But if you're in a room and Edu was there, he would always come over and talk to you. He was really, really approachable. He was the kind of the charmer as well. You'd sort of set, if Arsenal could send Edu into any sort of room, and immediately he's got that gravitas that people sort of go towards. So he sounds very, very different. And I guess also the departures were very, very different then, because obviously when Edu left, it was widespread shock around the club, and like, well, what happens now, because they've been so influential, and because probably he'd been always in front of the cameras and things like that, it just felt like a really big seismic departure at Arsenal for a time, at a time when no one was really expecting it, even though there had been whisperings. So it's going to be different, certainly. I think that's a really interesting thing about Berta's arrival at Arsenal. It just feels very un-Arsenal like. It's definitely a step away from the norm. They could have easily promoted from within, which Arsenal love to do. Jason Ito was right there, was very far along in the process, but they did move away. I mean, you as an Arsenal fan, do you feel, knowing what you know about Berta, that he could come in and sort of, I don't know if revitalise is just freshen things up, bring new ideas to a club that normally likes to promote from within?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really fascinating to see kind of how he adapts to the club, and I guess how the club adapts to him as well. And yeah, I guess it gives us an idea of kind of maybe the direction in which Arsenal want to go, or how they want to do things. Like I say, he's been, I think, I don't know if a polarizing figure, maybe that's too strong. I don't, maybe that's, that makes him sound sort of controversial. And I'm not sure that's the case here, but certainly here there've been people who would have a lot of, like I say, good things to say about him, and not such good things to say as well. I think that the fact that he is low profile in a public facing way, I guess we shouldn't confuse that, I guess, with being low profile kind of in the football world, and kind of behind the scenes and in boardrooms and with agents. Of course, that he is one of, because he's been working at the highest level with a top club who do a lot of deals. There's quite high turnover at Atletico Madrid, and has been really throughout the last decade. So this is a guy that's extremely well known, who knows all the people that you would want a football executive to know. But yeah, it's like you say, in terms of looking at him, looking at Edu, and you basically can't. It almost polar opposites, very, very contrasting figures, like you say, in terms of personality, in terms of style, in terms of how they approach job. And yeah, like I say, all his time here in Madrid, he's been there. I mean, you say in the shadows, and it makes it sound sinister. It's not sinister. It's just a different way of doing business, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I don't think one way is necessarily more valid than the other. I just think it depends what works for you, kind of as a personality, as the person, and as a sort of a business person, I guess. Just to explain why he left, because I guess I maybe left that hanging a little bit before. As I say, it had been sort of on the cards for months, at least going back to last summer, or maybe even longer. There were quite a lot of reports and accurate reports. There's sort of debate. It depends who you talk to about the scale of sort of behind the scenes clashes and disagreements, between him and Simeone and others. Different people give different versions of how big those differences were, but there were some disagreements there in terms of strategy, in terms of player recruitment, which players to target, which players not to target. Of course, you've got some big personalities there as well. And basically what Berta saw at Atletico was that his kind of remit and his kind of power base was squeezed over time. So Atletico appointed a football executive, a guy called Carlos Bulcero. I think that was last year that he came in, and he was basically kind of a head of football operations. So he kind of over Berta's head, basically only reporting to the chief executive, Miguel Angel Gil. And he ended up basically taking on a lot of the power that would have previously been seen as Berta's, went to Bulcero. And I think it was a pretty clear kind of signal to Berta, that maybe it's time for you to move on. And like I say, he had kind of less influence and less power. And in the end, they ended up negotiating his departure. And look, they were keen at the time to say that departure was amicable, that there were no hard feelings, that he feels good about his time at the club and look at what he's achieved, and the club are grateful to him. But there were some differences there, and I wonder. It's going to be so interesting to see what kind of strategy he adopts in terms of recruitment at Arsenal, and if we can maybe point to, I don't know, any sort of lessons that might have been learned from his time at Atletico, and how much kind of unity there is with Arteta, for example, who I do think it's fascinating that Berta's gone from working for one of the most kind of tough, hard-headed, single-minded, determined characters in football in Diego Simeone, straight to another in Mikel Arteta. He's not shy of a challenge, is he? Like, it's not like he's looking for an easy gig.
No.
Because but again, I guess in terms of his kind of CV and his resume, that's sort of what you'd look for, right? If you're like, if you want someone who's not going to be a pushover, I guess, because he wasn't a pushover at Atletico Madrid, and I think that's interesting as well, because I mean, you'd know a lot more than me, but I get the impression that at Arsenal in recent years, the move has been very much towards Arteta kind of growing in influence and power, right? And Berta, like I say, is not a yes man, at least from what we know about his time at Atletico.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, because when it started to look like Berta was going to get the job, the thing that really appealed to me was the fact that he'd worked so long alongside someone like Simeone, because it just felt like that it's kind of perfect not training, but it's just perfect for what you're going to get when you get to Arteta, because he is, like you said, very, very influential. He's grown influence at Arsenal. I do think though there's a sort of feeling around Arsenal fans, I think, that Arteta would want a yes man next to him, which I absolutely don't think is the case. I think Arteta likes to be challenged. He's that sort of character from what I know about him. So I think he'll enjoy that. But definitely the relationship between Simeone and Berta, I think, is what I'd like to explore a little bit more, because he was there an awful long time with Simeone, and inevitably there's going to be clashes there, because you've got two very powerful guys who at times will want the same thing, but at times that opinion is going to differ, isn't it? And so there's always going to be clashes there. But still, they managed to work alongside each other for an awful long time before eventually the move happened. So that's surely going to stand Berta in good stead, you would think, for working alongside someone like Arteta at Arsenal.
Yeah, I think there was some friction there sometimes. Like I say, I think that's almost inevitable when you're talking about kind of big characters and personalities. Yeah. With a lot of experience, with strong ideas, and also it's natural, isn't it? Because like the two, the role of a coach and the role of a sporting director, your job is different, and what you're looking to do is, of course, you've got a lot of the same objectives, but they're not always, kind of exactly the same, or indeed you might have different views of how to achieve, or just different opinions, about players, whether you rate a player or not, whether you think a player is right for the team or not. I mean, Simeone, of course, every manager has like an idea of how they want to play and what sort of players might fit into that idea and that style, right? But I think Simeone is at sort of the extreme end of that spectrum. I think he's extremely specific about the kind of players that he likes and he wants. I think he's very, very clear when he doesn't rate someone, and we did see that pretty consistently at Atletico, and not just in the early days. Even right up to the end, you would see, and not all the time, but you'd see players arriving who it was pretty clear to everyone, I think, that Simeone wasn't convinced by this guy. That Simeone had said, look, we need a left back or whatever, or a holding midfielder, and the club would bring him a left back or a holding midfielder, and well, how about this guy? And Simeone said, well, but if that's all you can do, if that's all you can do in the market, okay. But then, a number of times you'd see a player arrive, and literally Simeone, it was almost like, and I don't think this is an exaggeration actually, that he would like look at them in like a training session and be like, nah, I don't fancy this guy. And they would almost, I mean, to say they wouldn't be given another chance is unfair, because there are examples of players that have turned that around, and we can talk about some of those examples if you like, but they'd have to work really hard to convince him, because it's almost like his mind was made up. And that to me is quite a dysfunctional way to do things. I understand that what you do in the market isn't always ideal, and sometimes you have to compromise, right? Of course. But if you're bringing in players that almost instantly the manager's decided he doesn't like and doesn't want to use, that for me is like I say, is really kind of dysfunctional. And that did happen. It didn't always happen. I think if you look at most of Atletico Madrid's recruitment in terms of bringing players in and in terms of moving players on, it's been good. Because and the results are there because they've consistently refreshed the squad and built a team capable of challenging minimum for top four, and often challenging for the title and winning it once or twice. and competing for other trophies as well. So clearly, overall, the work they've done has been good. But there are, a number of examples, like I say, of players who've come in, if not against the manager's wishes, then kind of despite the manager's skepticism. And either they've had to work incredibly hard to win Simeone around, and eventually they have. There are one or two cases of that, or they haven't. They never have, and they've been moved on. There are cases even after 6 months or so where a player's come. And again, that's not unique to Atletico or to Simeone or to Berta, but it has been noticeable, and often not even for sort of trifling sums of money either. Even players for quite substantial transfer fees.
Can't really afford for that to happen at Arsenal, can you? I suppose when especially bringing people in Premier League wages who are so hard to shift on if you do get things wrong.
Yeah, that's one thing they've managed to do at Atletico is generally they got out of jail a bit, and the mistakes were dealt with. I mean, and everyone knows some of the highest profile examples. João Felix is sort of the ultimate one, right? Who was a player who was brought in. Now, I wouldn't say that he was primarily necessarily a Berta signing.
Well, I was going to say quickly on that, the signings, and João Felix is one of them. So when you look at the recruitment, I mean, I've got a list just on, where is it? Here, sort of just, these are billed obviously as Andrea Berta signings, and there's listed of fours there: Felix, Alvarez, Morata, Costa, Griezmann. These are just forwards. Obviously, there's been plenty more, but are they on Andrea Berta signings? I mean, surely we talk about the influence that Simeone has. Surely a lot of these are Simeone signings rather than Berta signings. So when you look through the success rate of sort of Berta's time as sporting director and failure rate, I suppose, when it comes to signings, does that fall on him? Does it fall on Simeone? Is it a collective? I mean, how did all the sort of signings work when it came to Atletico Madrid over the last decade or so?
Yeah, I think we can take it almost on a case-by-case basis, so we can talk about some of these names in particular, actually. Now, Berta as a sporting director obviously has a big part to play, Simeone as well, Gil, the CEO. In terms of a lot of people point to the close relationship with Jorge Mendes in a lot of Atletico's signings. I think Berta is a part of that, no doubt, but it also goes above him to kind of to chief executive level as well. I mean, obviously, João Felix is a Mendes player. He's one who I think I wouldn't lay sort of the failure of João Felix sort of solely or even primarily at Berta's feet. I think given the scale of the signing, the amount of money involved, I think it went above him. It went to sort of chief executive level, and it was a decision that at that time, that was a time when they just lost sort of Griezmann before he ended up coming back. They needed kind of a star forward player, and they went for him. It was always, I think, a huge gamble, a huge risk, probably the riskiest signing they ever made in terms of the money and in terms of the profile of player. He's another one who we quickly saw that he was not a good fit for a Diego Simeone team. They tried, and it's not to say he didn't have his moments. One season in particular, I think the league title winning season in 21, the first half of that season, he was very, very good. So he had his moments, but overall, I think almost everyone would look at that and say that was a failure. In the end, I've almost lost track of where we got to with that, because there were so many loans and so many. I think they got back. They managed to recoup some of what they had paid in the end, eventually. Someone like Julian Alvarez, he was really a Simeone signing in that Julian was a huge fan of Simeone as a kid and used to watch Atleti as a kid as well. Simeone was on the phone to him nonstop every day all summer trying to get him to sign. Simeone's kids of course, footballers were on the phone to him as well, telling him to come to Atleti and trying to sell him the idea. So I think Alvarez was really a Simeone signing. Other ones, Morata, I don't think you can identify as being one or the other. Diego Costa, Simeone was always a huge fan of his in terms of, I think, kind of mistakes. When they brought back Diego Costa the second time, that was for a lot of money, and he was never the player that he had been before he'd left for Chelsea, and that was a huge blunder as well.
I think managed to knock Arsenal out of the Europa League, though, didn't he?
I know. Yeah, I was there. I remember. Yeah, I remember it all too well. Otherwise, like I say, I think yes, you're right. It's wrong to look at every single, of course, all these deals and say Berta signing either a sale or a purchase. But he has been involved in all of these deals to some extent, for sure.
Does he have how do I put this? Does he have a type would you think of when you're sort of thinking of Berta signing some of the ones that he maybe has got more of the credit for? Does he have a type of player? Do you think is there a sort of vision for what a perfect Berta
I think it's
signing would
hard
be?
to say because I think it's so hard to separate that from Simeone's Atletico and the kind of players that Simeone has wanted to make a part of that team. I think he has been, although he hasn't always, as I say, hasn't always done it successfully. And there've been times when like I say, it feels a bit like a compromise player. Like we can't really get the guy we want, so we'll get this guy instead who doesn't quite fit. But overall, I think it's difficult to say because I think he has been recruiting for a Simeone team. In terms of where players have come from, you can look all over really. Of course, he's Italian. There have been some who've come in from Italy. There are players who've come in from South America as well. We've talked about Portugal. I don't think you can identify one market as being his preferred market or his strongest market. I mean, of course, now having been based in Spain for so long and going to the Premier League, Spain would seem a natural market to look at, and one that he's going to know well. Atletico have also, as one of the biggest clubs in Spain, quite frequently kind of snap up players from smaller clubs. But I don't know because, like I say, I think it's so hard to separate that from what a Simeone player is.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think we've seen from him kind of pragmatism in terms of signings. Like I say, they've been, and that's been both for good and for bad. In that sometimes players who might not have been kind of first choice or the ideal fit have been brought in. Sometimes they've worked, sometimes they haven't. But then at other times we've seen, sort of relative kind of gambles in terms of relatively unknown players. And you talk about Arsenal not being able to afford to make mistakes. Atletico Madrid, I know they're a big club, but they're not like swimming in money either. They have to be really quite careful about what they spend. Quite often, a lot of summers when we're looking at kind of Atletico's transfer business, they've got to kind of break even, or they've got to sell before they can buy, or they're looking at ways they can structure deals and loans, and so they don't have a lot of money to spend. That's why for them, Champions League money every single season has been so important. So he's used to working on not a very restricted budget, but a fairly restricted budget. I mean, you look at what clubs spend in Spain every year outside of Real Madrid, really, and it's nothing compared to the Premier League. The lesser Premier League clubs spend a lot more in terms of transfer fees than even the big Spanish clubs. So he is used to having to operate on a restricted budget and used to not having the luxury of making many mistakes. So Atletico haven't been able to afford that.
How's he known? Is he known as a tough negotiator, a good negotiator? If there's a deal to be done, is he seen as someone who can really go in there and get it done?
Yes, I think so. That's the impression that people have. I think also partly, I do think he has rubbed some people up the wrong way at times, and maybe that's why he has got this reputation that's a little bit divisive. Because I don't think. And again, this has come from I've never spent time with him personally, so I don't know the guy. But you hear what people say, and that might have clashed them a little bit, or might have found his way of doing things, his personality, a little bit off-putting. But generally, like I say, I don't want to come off as too negative because I feel like maybe I've spent too much time pointing out stuff that hasn't always worked. But like I say, I think generally you look at what Atletico Madrid have done over the last decade, and their record in the transfer market is good. It's really good. They've tended to get good deals. They've tended to identify players, bring them in at the right time. When it's time to move them on. And like I say, I think he's been a big part of that. So yeah, I think his reputation here certainly is of a tough negotiator, someone who might occasionally sort of rub people up the wrong way, but has a pretty consistent track record of getting good deals done.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at Arsenal's potential summer businesses this summer. It involves Spain quite heavily. You think Zubimendi, Juan Garcia at Espanyol, potentially, trying to get Nico Williams out of Bilbao, potentially. You think it probably will help with that. I mean, he's dealt with all these people before, hasn't he? And so you think if that's going to open doors, maybe that will help with the summer. I've got a load of questions that I've asked people to send in. So I know we've probably covered quite a lot of it from our sort of discussion so far, but we'll still rattle through some of them. Let me just bring these up. Okay, here's one from Kidzall. Says, please can you ask him about the signings were made at Atletico in terms of signings? Were they Andrea's or Simeone? I suppose we've covered that. Players get called Edu signings and Arteta signings, and I was wondering how often he liked to get his way. I mean, I can't imagine.
We all like to get our way, don't we? But yeah.
I can't imagine getting your way against Simeone very often. I imagine there's going to be
well, and like I say, there are cases of kind of players who, I mean, define get your way, because you might get your way in terms of a player comes in But then if they don't play, or they're not effective, or they don't contribute, have you got your way really? In terms of names, just to put kind of faces on this idea, I think there are a couple that are really kind of interesting, and they also happened quite late in his time at Atletico, so it's not like these are sort of early day mistakes that were then rectified. Going back a year or two, I think it was in January. Was it last January or the January before? They wanted a holding midfielder, central midfielder. This was what Simeone wanted, and they brought in a guy called Vermeeren, a young holding midfielder from the Netherlands, and paid decent money. I think it was 20 million euros, something like that. And this was in January, so that's a big move to make in January. Simeone didn't like him. I played like minutes, like a handful of minutes for the first team. Simeone basically made his mind up, made a couple of appearances for the team between January and May, and left that summer. This was last summer that we're talking about now, I think. Went on loan to, I think he's at Leipzig, has done quite well there. And in fact, I think his number of games there has triggered a clause to make that move permanent, and they're going to basically get their money back. But that's a recent example for me of a player who Simeone clearly didn't rate, was brought in at a cost, 20 odd million euros. That's big for Atletico in January, as in responding to a specific need of the team at an important time of the season, and didn't do it. And Simeone didn't like him, and he barely got a chance, and he moved on. And like that we're talking about the last year or two. So that's a recent example of a player that didn't quite work out. There are others that have kind of won Simeone round, and that maybe Berta's been proved to be right. Someone like there's a fullback called Javi Galan, who Atleti bought from Celta Vigo. When he first arrived, he's one of these players who reportedly, Simeone literally looked at in a few training sessions, didn't like him, barely played. The player got his head down, worked really hard, convinced Simeone, and this season he's played a lot of games. He's basically been first choice for a lot of the season. So it goes both ways. But yeah, I think it's going to be one to watch, because it is really one of the really eye-catching things from his time at Atleti is some of these players who clearly haven't been to the manager's taste, and the fact that they've arrived anyway. And like I say, we're not just talking about 10 years ago. We're even fairly recently.
Yeah, I struggle to see a way players arrive at Arsenal that Arteta hasn't given the green light to. I just don't see that happening. The way he's built that squad, his fingerprints are all over it. And like Simeone, he's got a very sort of strict view on what sort of player he wants and how he wants it to fit the system. I can't see players being brought in over his head. If that were to happen, I could see division creeping into things. I think
well, Arsenal might also have a bit more. I mean, like I say, Atletico, I know they're a big club, Champions League club, but Arsenal might have a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more pull in terms of some of those situations. I think have been, like I say, have been about Atletico kind of looking around for a player who fits the bill, and not necessarily being able to go for sort of top tier. Do you know what I mean? So, and maybe that's not a situation that Arsenal find themselves in. So it might not arise quite as much.
Right, a couple here from Tetanomics and Dominic, both on, I suppose, the sort of relationship that you can see forming between Arteta and Berta. So Tetanomics says, from his knowledge of both Arteta and Berta, what would he predict will be the biggest synergy and conflict points to look out for? And Dominic says, we know it's vital that Arteta and Berta work effectively together if Arsenal to succeed. Therefore, how does Berta go about conflict resolution internally, i.e. what happens when he disagrees on the manager's approach?
Yeah, that's the huge question. I mean, because like I say, Atletico Madrid, there has been internal conflict, and there has been internal conflict pretty consistently. Like I say, I don't want to overplay that. It wasn't all conflict.
No,
do you know what I mean? But there has been some, and there has been some consistently as well. And part of that is what led to his eventual departure. Now whether a fresh start and a new environment helps, and I imagine it probably does, because certain dynamics have existed in one place, it doesn't mean they have to carry on to another. Do you know what I mean? Because there are so many, if everything else is different, then maybe things change, and maybe he, handles things a different way. Like I say, even though we've talked about the similarities between Arteta and Simeone, they won't be identical in terms of power dynamics. The fact that he's new at Arsenal makes a huge difference, doesn't it? Atletico has been there for a long time. When you've been in an environment for a long time, there's a lot of time for relationships to go a certain way, and it's once you're in a certain dynamic, it's hard to sort of get out of it. Do you know what I mean? But so maybe a fresh start might be a change in terms of, conflict points to look out for. Like you say, it may well be different because Arteta may be even more powerful than Simeone in terms of having the final say, and in terms of getting exactly what he wants. And maybe Arsenal have a degree of resources which enables them to go and get, or enables Berta to go and get what the manager wants in a way that wasn't always possible at Atletico Madrid, I guess.
Yeah, Arteta was quite heavily involved in this process as well, which is interesting. You don't often get managers sort of picking their own sporting directors, but he was very heavily involved in this, and clearly Berta was someone he was quite excited to work for. We got one from Jay Swisley, I think that is. It says, "Hi Charles, can you ask him what big signings Berta has made that have been successful, good value for money? Felix was a flop, waste of money. Alvarez is a good player, but they overpaid massively. In my opinion, not sure many at Atletico would agree about that, given the season he's having at the moment. Just don't get."
Yeah, I think a lot of people felt that at the time. I think a lot of people,
well, I did
last summer were like,
I think I did as well, probably at the time. But he's having a great season.
He's been great, and he has so far. He has at least justified that price tag, or even now, you'd look at it. I think you'd say, okay, that's pretty good value. I'm trying to think. I mean, it might be worth even getting up the list of kind of previous of signings and trying to identify the ones that would be seen as being the best value for money. And like I say, I think most of the
Oblak's surely Oblak's been a fantastic.
Yes, Oblak is probably the best goalkeeper in Atletico's history. Has been consistently one of the best in the world for the last near decade. Had a little dip, but he's back where he ought to be now. And he's a player who I don't think anyone was talking about before. You're right. That's a great shout. He's probably just about the best example in terms of value. I mean, value for money. You see Luis Suarez there on that list. Now, of course, you've got to remember he came in really interesting circumstances. Was basically forced out of Barcelona. Barca decided he was finished. They literally said to him, like, "We don't want you. We think you're done." Suarez arrived very, very cheaply and won them the league. Not single-handedly, but played a big part in winning them the league. In terms of value for money, that's got to be right up there. Also, value for money, Antoine Griezmann, the second time coming back. So obviously, Griezmann was at Atletico previously, left for Barcelona, didn't go very well, didn't fit into the team with Messi. Atletico had to kind of work really hard, actually, and negotiate really hard. That was a really quite messy time to bring him back. I think it was initially on loan and then it was made permanent. But either way, eventually it was still a bargain because Griezmann is their all-time top scorer, still a sensational player. We think he's going to stay for another year. Has been arguably the most important player of the Simeone era. So no question that he was, like I say, when he came back was a bargain. Otherwise, I think there've been lots of deals that you'd look to and say, yeah, even last summer, even as recently as last summer, they had a pretty major rebuild last summer. We mentioned Julian, who, like I say, was largely sort of a Simeone target. But even otherwise, they brought in Robin Lenormand from Real Sociedad. He's been good. They brought in Alexander Sorloth from Villarreal. He's been very, very good, scoring a lot of goals off the bench. Conor Gallagher, not so much. The jury's still out on him a little bit. Hasn't won a place in the team. But like I say, even last summer was a fairly major rebuild. Spent quite a lot of money, and Atletico came out of it looking really strong. Like a lot of people would look at their squad right now. I know they've basically just dropped out of the title race with the result of the weekend, but they might have the best all-round squad in Spain right now, and that's a big statement to make when you're comparing them to Real Madrid and Barcelona. And Berta, of course, played a big part in that.
Before we get back to the questions, just on when Eddie arrived, he first he got his feet under the table. He sort of grew in power, and then he ripped up the sort of recruitment network across the world that Arsenal had built and Wenger had built. Francis Cagal was sort of overseeing. There was lots of redundancy made, and he really he went very data driven rather than on the ground sort of scouting network. Do you see, from what you know about Berta, do you see him? How involved do you think he'll be in the whole sort of scouting network and, trying to uncover gems from around the world? Or is he more of the sort of guy who's just going to be in there getting the big deals done and seem to get the big deals done? But do you see from what you know about him that he will be trying to, sitting in the office with the analyst guys and the recruitment team, really sort of putting his own fingerprints on that part of the club?
Well, that is his background. So before he was made sporting director at Atletico, he was in the scouting department. That was his first job at the club. Mm-hmm. So that was what he did before he essentially got promoted. So I'd expect him to be quite hands-on because, like I say, that's sort of the world that he comes from. Not originally. I think before football, he worked in business. But certainly when he arrived at Atletico, the scouting department was his thing. So yeah, I'd expect him to be quite hands-on.
Here's one from Carlo. He says, I'm fully behind still Arteta, backing him to bring silverware. But if he doesn't, do you see a way of Berta luring Simeone as a new manager? Can you see that? I don't see a way.
think
Given
so.
what you've said, I don't see a way.
Like I say, it's not. I think they left on the worst terms, but there were clashes behind the scenes, and Berta in the end was forced out. So no, I don't see. I mean, Simeone at Arsenal, it's. I don't. It's. I'd almost love to see it. Just be fascinating to see how. I mean, it's always been a huge question about how Simeone would do in the Premier League, how he would do away from Atletico Madrid. I talked about how him and the club are basically inseparable at this point. So it's impossible to imagine. Simeone was always sort of the anti-Wenger, wasn't he? In so many ways. I mean, Simeone's been close to moving to England before. He was offered the Man United job in 2016 after Atleti lost the Champions League final, and was going to go, changed his mind and stayed. So he's been open to a move to the Premier League in the past. Doesn't really speak English. There was quite a funny clip from training earlier this season of him and Conor Gallagher communicating in Simeone in sort of the most broken English possible. It was quite sweet. So yeah, that would be an issue. So no, I don't see it. But like I say, just out of just pure fascination, I'd be intrigued. Let's just say that.
Okay, this one from Piers says, how are Arsenal viewed in Spain and on the continent? Do people take us seriously in negotiations?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think people have been taking notice the last year or two because of Arteta. Because Arteta is, of course, he's an unusual kind of Spaniard in that he spent, of course, so little of his career in Spain, but he is Spanish, and people basically followed him from being Pep's assistant to taking over at Arsenal. And Arteta's Arsenal and how the sort of the transformation that he's put in place at that club has got a lot of attention here, and people know now that Arsenal are one of the best teams in the Premier League, one of the best teams in Europe. Of course, what they've done in the Champions League this year and last year helps. We've got a big test coming up of this, of course, with the Arsenal Real Madrid tie in the Champions League, so he'll be getting a lot more attention. But no, Arsenal are viewed, I would say, with a lot of respect. People look at that team, some of the players that they've brought into that team, the likes of Saliba, the likes of Gabriel. Well, yeah, right through the team really, and I think they think Arsenal are serious operators.
Yeah, this is one that's interesting one because of the way Arsenal tend to operate, and certainly it's been seen as a club that sort of dragged their heels a little bit in terms of getting things over the line. So we're a 7605 says, does Berta have a track record of making signings quickly or dragging them out?
Good question. I wouldn't say necessarily one or the other. I think you can point to examples of both. I think it would be wrong to say it's Berta, right? Because sporting directors are operating under quite a lot of restrictions in terms of budget, in terms of what they're given the okay to do, all sorts of in terms of what the other club is doing. So yeah, I'm sure there have been plenty of examples of moves that have dragged on, but you wouldn't necessarily say this is down to Berta personally. I don't think you can attribute that to him or his kind of style. I think it just depends on the circumstances of each transfer. Like I said, Atletico Madrid have tended to operate on quite a restricted budget. They've had to be so when deals have dragged on a little bit, it's because they've had to be careful, and they've had to really make sure that they're, as much as possible, they're getting the deal that's right for them. Of course, when you're operating in Spain between Spanish clubs as well, it's also a bit different because quite often dealing with release clauses. So when you're dealing with a player who's got a release clause, of course, that is one way of speeding up that process in a way that isn't always possible in the Premier League.
Okay, a couple more now before we wrap this one up. You've already talked about, obviously the summary of why he left, but it's that last bit. Will he be arriving at Arsenal with something to prove? Do you think he's arriving in his mind thinking, I've got something to prove now?
I think so. Like I say, he was very keen to present the departure from Atletico as being amicable, of being sort of proud of what he'd achieved there and been there for a long time. But I don't think that takes away the fact that, like I say, he was kind of forced out in terms of a lot of his power base was taken away from him. And so I think he does arrive with something to prove. Also, the fact that Atletico are the only big club he's ever worked at. Been there a long time, been there for over a decade. And so I think there's a huge question mark of, okay, you've got this track record of success, of building really competitive squads at the highest level. Can you do it again? Can you do it again? Can you do it in the Premier League? Can you do it, in an English-speaking environment, albeit a multilingual environment? So yeah, I think absolutely he's got something to prove. Also, I think if you can be successful, if you're successful at one club, then maybe people can look to take aspects of that success away from you, right? And they can say, okay, it's mostly down to Simeone or whatever. But if you go and do it at more than one club, then it gets harder for people to do that, right? And you can have people, and you can say, well, no, look, I mean, look at my track record; it speaks for itself over multiple clubs. So if he's successful at Arsenal, I think it does prove that it's as much about him as anyone else.
Cool. And then just finally, one from Jordan says, are there any players that Berta tried to sign for Atleti or showed strong interest in, which you could see him trying to get for Arsenal?
I mean, maybe the biggest player that they almost got and didn't get was maybe Lautaro Martinez. They were very, very keen on him. They were very, very close to him. I guess this was before he went to Inter. I don't know what year that would have. It was a while ago now, of course. But they were very keen on him. Simeone loved him as a player. You can imagine him as being a very Simeone type forward. Of course, you know, there's always that connection with Argentinian players as well. So he was one that got away. And I mean, Arsenal need a forward. I mean, I'm not saying, you know, you'd know more about that than me. I'm not saying he's a target or anything like it, but he's probably the biggest name who was close to Atletico, who they regretted, I think, not getting.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, that's a brilliant way to end it. Before we go, though, you mentioned it about a few minutes ago. There is a big Champions League doubleheader looming large between Arsenal and Real Madrid, first leg next week, which regular viewers of this channel will know I'm missing at the Emirates, which I'm far from happy about. I will be in Spain, though, for the second leg. I'm at Centre Parks. Can you believe that? I'm at Centre Parks for the first leg. Arsenal versus
yeah, but you know, Centre Parks, isn't it? I mean, it's as an alternative, it's not bad. I'll be at the Bernabeu. I still don't know if I'll be at the Emirates. My accreditation request is in, but I haven't heard back yet. So I'll be at least at the Bernabeu, and I'm not sure yet if I'll be at the Emirates as well.
Yeah, I'll definitely be at the Bernabeu, and I've never been before, so I'm delighted. I went to, as I said, I went to Atletico Madrid for the semi-final when Diego Costa knocked us out. So really looking forward to this. I mean, how do you see it going? Obviously, Madrid are going to be overwhelming favourites, as they always are in Champions League games. You know, the lack of striker for Arsenal is an issue, but we might have Bukayo Saka back. I mean, Mikel's speaking in his press conference very soon. We'll find out what he's got to say about him, but the hope is that he'll definitely be fit to feature, whether it be from the start. We'll have to wait and see. But I mean, when you look at the two legs and you look at the two sides, what are your thoughts? A, as a Madrid correspondent, but B, as an Arsenal fan as well. I mean, what are you expecting?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting, and yeah, of course, it's basically impossible for me to analyze this with any degree of objectivity. As a fan, my initial response when the draw was made was I couldn't see a way that Arsenal would go through. But I'll say this: I think Arsenal are a better all-round team than Real Madrid. Real Madrid this season are not a good team. They have spectacular players. You know, some of the absolute best players. You look at the Ballon d'Or shortlist from last year, and you've got Mbappe and Vinicius and Bellingham all there in the top five. So they've got the best players that you can have, but they are not a great team, and they are not playing great football. You know, I was there at the Bernabeu at the weekend. They beat Leganés, relegation threatened Leganés 3-2. Had to come back to do it. We're losing 2-1 at one point. It's been a funny old season at Madrid. You know, generally they've been all right. You know, they're there fighting for the title with Barcelona. They're in the Champions League. They're in the Copa del Rey semi-finals, but they haven't been playing well. They haven't been playing convincingly, consistently. They've dropped points in lots of games that they shouldn't have, and it's exactly the problem that a lot of people thought this team might have. Is that yes, you've got Mbappe and Vinicius and Rodrigo and Bellingham up front, but where's the balance to the team? And in a lot of games, that balance hasn't been there. When they get it right, when they're all kind of switched on and they're all working hard as a team, especially out of possession, off the ball, they have got it right at times this season. We saw it against City, for example, in the Champions League, but often they don't. And when they don't, often it looks like there's kind of no midfield there. You've got the forwards and you've got the defense, and there's nothing in the middle. The defense is weak, of course. Danny Carvajal, who's out all season with an ACL tear, is a massive miss for them as a defender and as a character. Let's see what they do against Arsenal, but against City they played Fede Valverde, who's brilliant, out of position right back, which deals with that issue, but leaves more of a gap even in midfield. So they're not a great team, and like I say, all round, like as a unit, I think Arsenal are a better coached team than Real Madrid, and I think Arsenal will give them a really good game. Now, will that be enough? I think probably not, just because Madrid have got so much quality. And if those players, like I say, turn it on enough in the right moments, I think Madrid will go through. Yes, you mentioned the lack of a forward. I'd be more optimistic if this was sort of Arsenal full team at their best. I think they'd give it a really, really good go, and I wouldn't rule it out. Like you say, Saka being back is massive. But I think there'll be times over the 2 legs when Arsenal outplay Real Madrid. But like I say, will that be enough? No, maybe, because in moments, that's the thing. In moments, Madrid have got so much quality that they can hurt you and they can win a game or a tie.
That's the thing. Is the difference? It's the star power up front is just going to, for me, I look at it and just think that's going to be the difference, because, like you said, I can absolutely see Arsenal frustrating Madrid, being, tactically being very, very good, but it's just, can you see them scoring the goals they need to score at one end? I don't think you can over 2 legs. And when you've got what Madrid have got at the other end, you can just see that. I think that's just it just tips it in their balance over the course of 2 legs. But yeah, I mean, you never know. You never know. Back in 2006, I didn't give Arsenal a chance going into those two games, especially when you looked at what they were going to have to do in defence. And played 180 minutes, didn't concede a goal, and went through. Obviously, they had Thierry Henry at the other end to do what he did at the Bernabeu. But
that helps.
Who knows? Maybe Mikel Merino will turn into Thierry Henry for a night. When you look at the sort of key areas, I mean, where do you see it? I mean, I'm intrigued by Timber versus Vinny Jr. I think that's going to be a fantastic battle over the 2 games. I mean, where do you sort of see the tie being won or lost? Maybe for both teams, if you look at, if Arsenal are going to win, who's going to have a good game? If Real Madrid do get it done, who do you think is going to be the sort of star man for them?
Yeah, in terms of Madrid, I mean, Vinny's having an interesting season. He hasn't been consistently at his best right the way through, but he's had some really big games and some really good big performances, especially in the Champions League, against City, against Dortmund in the league phase. Mbappe is getting better and better. He has done right the way through the season, scored 2 goals again at the weekend. Jude Bellingham tends to be a player who kind of steps up and scores important goals in decisive moments. He's done that ever since he arrived at Real Madrid. In terms of weaknesses in the Madrid squad, like I say, it's the midfield, especially if Fede Valverde isn't there, if he's at right back. If he's not at right back, then it's Lucas Vazquez at right back, and that's a massive weakness for Real Madrid. The fullbacks on both sides are big weaknesses for Real Madrid. And I think, I mean, people, certainly the impression of Arsenal that people have here is that it's all about how good the defence is. So let's see how Saliba and Gabriel get on against Mbappe, like you mentioned, Timber. I mean, Timber is, if you could, pick any player to have a go up against Vinicius, it's probably him. And yeah, let's look. I mean, you joke about Mikel Merino, but let's see how Madrid's defense kind of deal with him. I don't know. I mean, in terms of defense, Antonio Rudiger, of course, is a very good player. Alongside him, it's likely to be young Asensio, because Militao's out injured long term. Alaba's back, but isn't always first choice. And maybe Merino can cause them some problems. I mean, the midfield will be key, like I say, because Madrid's midfield often seems to go missing this season. Luka Modric isn't the player that he once was, doesn't always play anyway. Camavinga's brilliantly talented, but hasn't yet worked out how to kind of control a midfield. Tchouameni is very good, I think, off the ball, but not very good when he's in possession. They've been trying to get blast from the past, Dani Ceballos back from injury, which may make Arsenal fans laugh, but he actually, when he came into the team earlier this season, was really important for Real Madrid. And it's not because he's a great player, because I don't think he is, but they need a kind of player like that in midfield, Madrid, in terms of lots of touches, dictating the tempo, keeping the ball moving. Ceballos was doing that really well, got injured. We're not sure yet if he'll be back for the Arsenal games. I think they're hopeful that he will be, but we're not sure. But in his absence, certainly, Madrid's midfield has really struggled.
Perfect. Alex, thank you very much for joining me, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure. And everyone, if you don't follow Alex already, you can do. His details are in the description below. It's been a pleasure. As I said, thank you for the insight. And thank you, everyone, for watching and for listening. Again, I'll be back in the morning to do another thing as we really gear towards that game against Fulham. Finally, Arsenal returning to action in the Premier League. Alex, I'll see you at the Bernabeu, mate. Thank you again.
See you there.
Bye-bye.